Let's look into the questions that we had pertaining to Darwin and Freud. The chapters Darwin and Freud. So Darwin, first question up, which three thinkers does Alberto consider to be among those of the naturalistic school, and why? As in, why does he consider these to be among them? So if we take a look on page 406, pretty straightforward, about midway down, that was a lot of names at one time. Are we talking about Marx, Darwin, or Freud? In a broader sense, we can talk about a naturalistic current from the middle of the 19th century until quite far into our own. By naturalistic, we mean a sense of reality that accepts no other reality than nature and the sensory world. A naturalist, therefore, also considers mankind to be part of nature. A naturalistic scientist will exclusively rely on natural phenomena, not on either rationalistic suppositions or any form of divine revelation. And that applies to Marx, Darwin, and Freud? Absolutely. The key words from the middle of the last century were nature, environment, history, evolution, and growth. Marx had pointed out that human ideologies were a product of the basis of society. Darwin showed that mankind was the result of a slow biological evolution. And Freud's studies of the unconscious revealed that people's actions were often the result of animal urges or instincts. So we didn't mention Marx hardly at all in the in-depth lecture, except in regards to his attempt to, his correspondence with Darwin, basically. But why is he naturalistic and say Hegel isn't? Hopefully, is readily apparent. He's looking at if Hegel's absolute spirit, which is of course this kind of stand-in of a sort for God. This is a supernatural, teleological principle towards something. Now we can say Marx too has this sort of sense that everything is moving toward a certain goal or a certain basic principle of unification of sorts, but it is not based on something supernatural, rather that it's based in natural material, natural reasons, historical materialism, as we were talking about last time. All the others too, it should make sense. Again, they are all naturalistic in the sense that they are not looking to a hand by a divine being or by anything else, even idea itself, as somehow guiding these principles, but rather that these things are inherent to the nature, as it were, of the phenomenon themselves. What does Alberto compare the idea of natural selection to in order to explain it? Briefly reiterate in your own words. So that is found on page 413. He says, they were just talking about Lamarckianism, which we didn't talk about in the in-depth lecture, but I think you got a good spell of it already here in Gaarder. And it says, Darwin is beginning to pursue another much more obvious line of thought. You could almost say that the actual mechanism behind the evolution of species was right in front of his very nose. I would have you work out the mechanism for yourself. So if you had 3 cows, but only enough fodder to keep 2 of them alive, what would you do? And Sophie explained she would have to slaughter one of them. And then Alberto asks, what about for the best milking cow? Well, or the best one, calving cow, the one that produces the best milk will be best calve. And so on and so forth. The best hunting dog should be the one that hunts best, and so forth. So what is the mechanism that is being used here? He's referring to artificial selection, as we talked about it in the lecture, the in-depth lecture, the selector being human beings. And he's using that as the very, not even analogy, but very similar mechanism, only instead of artificial in the sense that humanity itself selects, environment selects, nature itself selects. So he even mentions artificial selection on 4:14. So this is important. It's important to get that, not just because Gaarder is using it as an analogy, but also, or Alberto's using it as an analogy, but also because this is actually part of what maybe inspired Darwin to think as he did about natural selection. Next up, what aspect of the mind was Sigmund Freud most interested in exploring and understanding, and why? This is a little bit more grayish, but check out page 432 in particular. This is hopefully a little more illuminating. Alberto said, Freud, his theory of the unconscious is necessary to an understanding of what a human being is. Freud held that there is a constant tension between man and his surroundings, in particular a tension or conflict between his drives and needs and the demands of society. It is no exaggeration to say that Freud discovered human drives. Now, if you put down the unconscious, which I think is indeed adequate, or if you put down human drives, that will also be adequate. However, the human drives specifically, they originate for Freud in the unconscious, and it was this idea of the unconscious as pertaining to each individual, not just something that doesn't have consciousness, but something that literally exists within us that lacks our awareness or consciousness. So I would say the unconscious is the most correct answer. Human drives are an aspect of that, or components of that even. And anything along those lines will suffice. What are the three parts to Freud's theory of personality in the conscious and unconscious, and how do they relate to what he calls the pleasure principle and the reality principle? Briefly mentioned the pleasure principle in the lecture, didn't say anything about the reality principle, but hopefully you got the sense of what that would correspond to. But in any case, for Gaarder's take a look at page 433. And nearly at the bottom, a couple paragraphs from the bottom. When we come into the world, we live out our physical and mental needs quite directly and unashamedly. If we do not get milk, we cry, or maybe we cry if we have a wet diaper. We also give direct expression to our desire for physical contact and body warmth. Freud called this pleasure principle in us the id. As newborn babies, we are hardly anything but id. We carry the id or pleasure principle with us into adulthood and throughout life, but gradually we learn to regulate our desires and adjust to our surroundings. We learn to regulate the pleasure principle in relation to the reality principle. In Freud's terms, we develop an ego. An ego which has this regulative function. Even though we want or need something, we cannot just lie down and scream until we get what we want or need. Although I'm sure there are some people who still try this strategy. Not very appropriate anymore. We may desire something very badly that the outside world will not accept. We may repress our desires. That means we try to push them away and forget about them. And we saw how this, in turn, is responsible for what Freud was seeing as the symptoms, the external or more obvious symptoms that seem completely unrelated to anything that would have to do with, say, being married to the right man or woman, or being abused by one's parents or anything like that. One would not necessarily equate these or connect them in any way whatsoever with the symptoms exhibited with the underlying cause of them. But that's precisely what Freud gets at here through his theory of the unconscious and repression. However, Freud proposed and worked with a third element in the human mind. From infancy, we are constantly faced with the moral demands of our parents and of society. When we do anything wrong, our parents say, "Don't do that," or "Naughty, naughty, that's bad." Even when we are grown up, we retain the echo of such moral demands and judgments. It seems as though the world's moral expectations have become part of us. Freud called this the superego. Now, obviously, how these three parts, the id, the ego, and the superego, relate to the pleasure and the reality principles is that if the pleasure principle is these drives we have for wish fulfillment, mainly the source of which is the id, right? Then the pleasure principle would have us seek to do whatever brought us immediate pleasure. However, the reality principle will be anything that also demands that we repress such drives or such impulses outright, if only to prevent perhaps our rejection from the family or society, in order to keep the peace, in order to be acceptable as individuals. Now, this is sometimes seen as just a overly rigid and overly stereotyped way of relating one's moral aptitude in life to one's upbringing as a child. But keep in mind that this is, again, a theory that has, for very good reasons, continued to, while also being further developed and evolving and being amended in some ways, also has lasted up to the modern day very tightly, and is an important aspect of not just psychology but medicine in general to think about. What part of Freud's psychology does Alberto believe he and Sophie can use as leverage against Hilda's father? Two specific places I want to point out, though. So we're going to find it primarily on page 446. But before we go there, let's go to page 440, just to remind ourselves of something important. Midway down, the actual process of converting the latent dream thoughts to the manifest dream aspect was termed by Freud the dream work. We might call it masking or coding what the dream is actually about. In interpreting the dream, we must go through the reverse process and unmask or decode the motif to arrive at its theme. So we need to understand this theory of dream work, or the idea of dream work. We didn't talk about it at all, to my recollection, in the in-depth lecture. But the dream was, for Freud, that sort of place preconsciously where we have at least some closest to direct access to our own unconscious drives and so forth. So this is a prime location for such symbolic representations of those drives to be experienced and potentially to be interpreted. Now, if we go to page 446, we'll see what Alberto has in store for their escape. All right, here we are. Right, starting from the top of the page. We have talked about dreams. There's a touch of irony about that too. For what are we but the Major's dream images? But there is still one thing he hasn't counted on. Maybe he is embarrassingly aware of his own dream. He is aware of everything we say and do, just as the dreamer remembers the dream's manifest dream aspect. It is he who wields it with his pen, but even if he remembers everything we say to each other, he is still not quite awake. What do you mean? He does not know the latent dream thoughts, Sophie. He forgets that this too is a disguised dream. You're talking so strangely. The Major thinks so too. That is because he does not understand his own dream language. Let us be thankful for that. That gives us a tiny bit of elbow room, you see. And with this elbow room, we shall soon fight our way out of his muddy consciousness, like water voles frisking about in the sun on a summer's day. Remember, again, this is not just Alberto voicing Albert Nag's thoughts and, imaginations and so forth. This is just as much Alberto voicing Albert Nag's voicing of Gaarder, Jostein Gaarder's thoughts and imaginations and so forth. So it would be fascinating to think about this for a second. I mean, this book seems so highly structured, very much so, as a textbook for philosophy, perhaps even if we allow it to gain that status. But if this is true, if the Major is writing and is not even aware of what sort of undercurrent is pervading the source of inspiration and imaginations for his writings, then so too for Gaarder. And you also perhaps will be able to identify something of yourself in this phenomenon. If you've ever talked with somebody about something or written something down, have you ever noticed how much of what you're writing doesn't seem to be directly conscious? Almost like there's something autopilot-like in what's being said or what's being written down. Even at this very moment, I'm only dimly aware of what it is that I'm saying. It's almost like I run and there's this almost filter, a consciousness filter, that a lot of stuff still is going to slip by, and maybe I go back and I edit it out later in the video, or maybe even in my very consciousness at this moment, continue to edit as I go along before it can even reach that phase. And yet stuff will still slip by, as I said. So this is something that we would expect to happen less frequently with a writer who has enough time to reflect and go back and edit their words before it's published. But at the same time, what if it's not? What if this is partly Gaarder allowing himself to publish what it is that really came up for him in the moment? And regardless of whether it is or not, in general, our artistic expressions or even just our everyday utterances should probably be put under the same magnifying glass of introspection. What is it that we're so sure about is us speaking in terms of the conscious I that is responsible for this thing that I am saying or writing? And then as far as how this may end up being a leverage point, we have yet to see perhaps, but nonetheless, perhaps you can already get the sense that if the dream work is about interpreting the dreams, maybe Alberto is going to take this. You wouldn't imagine a dream element interpreting itself, but maybe to some extent this has to do with the way that Alberto plans to get past this dream phase and do what? What do you do? What does a dream element become when it's no longer part of a dream? Maybe that's the question worth trying to answer. Venture a guess before you read on. For the last question, what is the significance of the character of the naked emperor appearing in the chapter on Freud? I don't know about you. I know that I used to hear this story as a child as well. The emperor is tricked by a couple of tailors who just want some money. They're paid handsomely for a fabric or a sort of garment of which is so fine, so that no one it will be able to even make out the thread, will be able to perceive the thread until they've finished with their work. And so they go about, they get paid handsomely for doing nothing, of course, but pretending to weave this garment and put it on the emperor and praise him and so forth. And then he goes out in a parade in public, and lo and behold, he's in fact naked, and the tailors run off with the money that they got for their service. If there's a much better retelling of it, you can find just about anywhere. YouTube it, perhaps. But nonetheless, that's what's happening here. So it's on pages 430 and 431. I won't actually reread any of it because it's pretty clear. So the naked emperor shows up on the doorstep, and well, first of all, there's the fact that Sophie wants to see who it is. Have you noticed this about Sophie? She keeps wanting to see. She makes, sometimes she gives a good reason. Well, Albert Nag could end up tearing the house down if we don't look. But in this case, it was very specifically, Alberto says, let's just put our hands over our ears and perhaps it'll go away. No, I want to see who it is, says Sophie, page 430. She wants to investigate. She wants to do something Freudian here. She wants to look at what it is that's behind the door that is unconscious to them at this moment until they open the door and take a look. And of course, what do you see? A sort of instantiation of the very sexuality that Freud is talking about in his theory work, or at least Alberto is relaying to us about Freud. And he's not embarrassed by his nakedness. That is an important aspect of the story. He's unaware of the very nakedness that he is embodying. And then at some point, the superego, you could say, comes in and dominates. He's suddenly very conscious of what everybody is actually looking at of himself, that he is indeed stark naked, and he covers himself and runs and represses himself, essentially, represses his very being in public. This is not, though, just a way of talking about Freud, perhaps. Perhaps this is also, again, some semblance of I don't want to say Gaarder, but maybe Albert Nag, by way of Gaarder wanting to feed this into our thoughts of Albert Nag letting loose a little bit here. He's allowing a lot more naked characters now suddenly into the story. So both Adam and Eve and this naked emperor, everyone of whom is unclothed, are showing up within the span of the same few pages. And so perhaps this too is him just getting a little bit too lucid and allowing some of his own sort of repressed drives and stuff around sexuality and nakedness to be coming in through the book. So we're getting a glimpse too, again, of Albert Nag and his sort of precariousness with being able to control his own characters or control who he introduces into the story. It's more and more childish as we move along. It's just clearly, if he was ever seen as a god before, now by this point in the book, we can't help but look at him and just go, man, what an immature author this Albert Nag appears to be. Two other quick things before we move on. Go back to page 409. This is in the Darwin chapter. You'll notice that I couldn't help but suppress a bit of a giggle myself when on page 409 we see that Gaarder writes about the origin of species and says, secondly, that evolution was the result of natural selection, and Sophie innocently says the survival of the fittest, right? And Alberto continues, that's right. and then continues to talk about evolution. Do you remember how we said that was actually not necessarily what Darwin was trying to get across so much as what Herbert Spencer was trying to get across? And this is what has spurred some of our misconceptions about both natural selection and evolution, and just the way of the world in general is this misconception of the survival of the fit versus survival of the fittest. Something to continue to keep in mind. While we're on this point, I didn't point it out either in the in-depth lecture, but something that is less, it's still somewhat contested, but it's a lot less prosperous these days, is the idea of the primal soup vision that Darwin himself had and many have had since. We tend to think of a primal soup in which the first strands of DNA, by some sort of combinations of like electrolysis and chemicals and maybe even thermal heat vents and stuff like that. Maybe this combined in some way into this sort of thermal soup gesture of by which these DNA could spread. However, since then, so many other ideas have come out, and probably the most prominent two are that one, complex factors that give way to more complexity, more complex selection processes, which actually gives way to a number of different ideas and theories. But that's a sort of broad category. Another important category is the idea of panspermia, which is that perhaps the first DNA for Earth, that is life before life was here on Earth, actually journeyed across some expanse of space by way of meteorite or something else, and then crash landed here in the waters, and maybe not as a one-time event, maybe multiple times, and then gave rise to the right conditions for life to come about. That, of course, doesn't answer the question, then where did that DNA come from, and how would the conditions for life there have been promoted? But nonetheless, there are multiple theories now, and primal soup does not probably, though it's maybe the most popular one, is probably not the most successful one in the long run. And lastly, page 430, I wanted to point this out too. This is just Hilda, again, thinking about who Alberto and Sophie are. She could not fathom that they were no more than electromagnetic impulses in her father's brain. She could not fathom, and certainly not accept, that they were only paper and printer's ink from a ribbon in her father's portable typewriter. One might just as well say that she herself was nothing but a conglomeration of protein compounds that had suddenly come to life one day in a hot little pool. She was more than that. She was Hilda Muller-Nag. It is comforting for me, too, to remember that those like Gaarder would agree with me, and I in turn agree with him, that we can't be over reductionistic about the way we think about any of these new findings and discoveries. We have to be careful with how we move forward. It's wonderful to broaden our view and create new models and expand our picture of what we might call reality. We also have to keep in mind that ultimately none of these models and pictures or images will substitute for the reality itself, always in the end impossible of being reduced down to by something else, by genes, by ideas, by anything, as it were. That will be all for today. Join us next time for Philosophy Today.